Actually left my small flock of sheep to come here, including a set of triplet lambs and a set of twin lambs. ITP staff has made my job very easy as moderator by taking care of introductions, and then I understand later taking care of the roving mics. So I will be brief. I've actually known Scott for years with work not beyond the Farm Bill, but work on the Farm Bill. RAFI USA is an important member of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which is also represented here today, and Scott served for a number of years on the Organizational Council for the National Sustainable Ag Coalition. So excited and interested to be here today to go from work on the Farm Bill with Scott to work beyond the Farm Bill. I just met Liz this morning, but I've had the pleasure of working with many of her colleagues at the Western Organization of Resource Councils over the years, probably most notably at their member organizations in North Dakota and South Dakota, Dakota Rural Action and Dakota Resource Council. Liz and Scott are each going to talk for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're going to have ample time for a discussion. So please, as they are talking, be thinking of what your questions are so we can jump into conversation. You might wonder, I think as the panelists first did when presented with this dual set of topics on fair prices and natural resources, what's the overarching theme? And I think the overarching theme that puts the two of them together is the same thing that binds a lot of this meeting together. And it's what Fred referred to in his comments this morning as well. Think about it at core about markets, market issues, market structure issues, and particularly for this panel, market externalizations and exploitations. Whether that be the exploitation of soil and water and other natural resources, or whether it be the exploitation of labor and human capital. I think that's our frame today. I've asked our panelists to be provocative, and Scott promised me right before the session started that he was going to talk about how dangerous the local food movement is. So I trust that will be provocative.
Thanks, Fred.
Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Scott first, and then Liz.
Thanks, Brian. To quote, is this thing on? Is it speaking to the machine? So I was given the task of summing up all of the policy history on fair prices to farmers and the entire state of play on providing fair prices to farmers in 6 minutes. And those of you who know me know that I can't say hello in 6 minutes, but I will do my best. And we really started out with and I really want to appreciate Fred's remarks earlier, which set this up beautifully and really brought out a lot of the themes of what we had been talking about in terms of the coming transformation and the transformation that I think we've all been a part of. But we start out with a supposition that industrial agriculture, that core to the profit proposition is the exploitation of people, land, and animals. It's not a byproduct, it's core to the value proposition. Now, when I was taking classes on sustainable agriculture, which is longer ago than it was on slates, and we had one of the core concepts that I was always taught was that the difference is that we really look at systemic issues, try to look at the system rather than symptomology. And one of the challenges that I think we have in federal policy is while a lot of us get that on a biological level, we frequently don't get it on a policy level. So a lot of what I see is a focus on symptoms, not on core systems. And we go back, so I'm going to do 2 sentences on commodities programs, one of which is core to commodities programs is the whole concept of antitrust and issues of antitrust. And I would urge to put on the table the whole set of hearings done by the Department of Justice and USDA back in 2010, which ended up in doing absolutely nothing. And but laid out very graphically the challenges associated with the huge corporate concentration and the power that corporate concentration in agriculture is able to leverage. And in fact, despite a lot of folks in this room doing a huge amount of work on telling the truth in those hearings, the net result was that you had one of the most determined administrations to actually do something about it, and the fact that they then completely backed off, fired the people who were fired up about it, and threw it under the bus, basically reinforced the power of those groups. And so as Fred was talking about the coming change, the coming transformation and that challenge, one of the things that keeps coming back into my mind as we look at what happened during the economic downturn or the economic crisis, the near economic collapse, even the tsunamis, the massive tsunamis in Southeast Asia, a lot of the issues around natural disasters, is never underestimate the ability of those in power to leverage public resources and public will towards the propping up and subsidization of the status quo and the reinforcement of patterns of profit. We have basically 3 eras of commodity programs from approximately their founding, which was very much based in antitrust, the combination of antitrust and the Dust Bowl back in the 1930s. The first era, and this is a broad generalization, but bear with me, I only have 7 minutes, so what the hell. Go from that point until the Reagan administration, in essence, it was a set of policies that were to enforce a fair price in the marketplace. So you had things like quotas and grain reserves and a whole series of mechanisms that were used to assure that companies were not allowed to use their market power to drop prices below what was a fair return. Under the Reagan administration, when Reagan literally sold the grain bins of the grain reserve, that transformed into what I think of as the second era of commodities programs, which is, well, don't worry about where the price goes. The taxpayer will cut you a check, and that led into the fairly gross stories of large checks being written to people on commodities programs. This farm bill, and let me ask a quick question: how many organizations in the room did action alerts on the farm bill in this past farm bill? How many of you did action alerts? How many of you did action alerts on the creation of the ARC and PRC and commodities programs and changes to commodity programs? It's a massive difference. This is one of the major changes in commodity policy ever. What we've moved into is, instead of having is in essence moving into an insurance model. What's happening is that crop insurance and commodities programs are melding to form a revenue insurance model. And what that means is it's the complete abdication of the role of the government in maintaining a fair price in the marketplace. It's basically saying, we wash our hands of it, we're simply going to get people to pay for their own heavily subsidized insurance. So this is sort of a new era of commodities programs and what that looks like. Now, what a commodity does, what a commodity means is, so products have value that is associated with all of the who, what, where, when, and how. What it is, how it's grown, where it's grown, who grows it, when it was grown, all of those things have value. And what a commodity basically says is none of those things have value except for the what. Corn is corn. Doesn't matter who, doesn't matter when, doesn't matter how, corn is corn. That's what commodification means. And so as we look at the commodification of vegetables, of local food, of other things, that struggle is the elimination of the value of who, what, when, where, and all the things that we talk about a lot. So if we look at the history of our movement, for want of a better term, is this question of how does the value associated with a product get distributed back down the chain, and Fred spoke to that earlier, and how does that value get distributed back down the chain? Our battle has been, how do you reintegrate externalized costs? How do you force the reintegration of externalized costs on the very large commodity-based agriculture? And then how do you create and protect space that actually rewards farmers for not externalizing costs, that provides value to farmers who do not externalize, that internalize those costs? And those two things are, the theory is that the two sort of meet in the middle. But the challenge that we have is, a piece of that, so on the big side, what we have is a farm bill that is, in essence, a monument to industry being able to externalize, they used to be able to externalize sort of emergency costs and things like that. Now, so one of the things that I would point out is a recent proposal that is to provide subsidized insurance for contract poultry growers for market disruptions. So what that means is that what we're looking at is a crop insurance model that is a heavily subsidized insurance model to keep poultry growers in when they get cut off by companies. And so what we now have is this externalization of responsibility of what would be the companies onto the farmer and onto the taxpayer. This is the privatization of profit and the externalization of not just risk, or the socialization not just of risk, but of cost, of the cost of doing business, the cost of, and we could talk a lot about contract poultry. I'm already past my time, but the one other thing that I wanted to point out was one of the major trends over the last 30 years is vertical integration of agriculture. The two most vertically integrated sectors of agriculture are confinement poultry and a farmer's market. Both are heavily vertically integrated. And the question is, from which end, so the space that we have created around sustainable food and organic and other, and this space that we try to create as the alternative is going to vertically integrate. We've already seen it in organic to a certain extent. Other forms of specialty agriculture is going to vertically integrate, and the core question that we have in front of us is from which end? From which side is it going to vertically integrate? And to me, one of the most dangerous pieces to maintaining and protecting that ground that we have all worked for a very long time to create is the transition of focus, the transition of both consumer and activist focus, largely around young people, from organic, which has clear standards, not perfect, but clear standards and clear value in the marketplace, and a clarity of certification, to labels like local and natural and sustainable, where they are. I was at a meeting where the national produce buyer for Walmart spoke, and their take was local has no definition. We will fight to keep it that way. And our definition is, if it is fresh produce and it is in your local Walmart, it is local to you, and that is local. And so this transition, we find the focus on local to be extraordinarily dangerous. Because it has the opportunity, if we think that now that we have created this value and we've created an opportunity for people who believe in the things, that believe in the reintegration of these costs and the rewarding of the people who do not externalize those costs, of people, land, and animals, that now that that has value, our next main challenge is the attack of that ground and maintaining the integrity of that ground. And if we think, you know, my local Harris Teeter grocery store, the produce section is called the farmer's market. If we think that PR companies aren't spending huge amounts of money to figure out, you know, one of my favorite quotes about this stuff, we're going to quote a lot of all the Leopold and cool people. My favorite quote on this is Louis B. Mayer of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the movie mogul, who said, "The most important thing is sincerity, and if you can fake that, you've got it made." And what I would say about local sustainable food is the most important thing is authenticity. What people want is an authentic experience, food with a face, a taste, and a place. What people want, so the most important thing is authenticity, and if you can fake that, you've got it made. And there are a lot of people spending a huge amount of money to fake that. And so I hope that's what I wanted to throw out for discussion.
Liz? Hold your burning questions for Scott. Write them down on a piece of paper.
Yeah, right now. I actually wish we could talk about this right now because I think it's so important. But unfortunately, I have to shift a little bit away and talk about the value of protecting natural resources. So good morning. My name is Liz Moran. I'm a regional organizer with the Western Organization of Resource Councils based in Billings. I want to thank Brian and thank Pete and Anna from IATP for having us on this panel. Really appreciate it. And thanks, Scott, for that excellent conversation. I'm looking forward to the questions and answers. So I want to tell you just quickly, WORC is a regional network of 7 state-based grassroots organizations in the West, in the Rocky Mountain West and Northern Plains. We have 10,000 members in 40 local chapters. And one of those members is here with me today, Scott Horner. He's an organic farmer from the western slope of Colorado with the Western Colorado Congress. Scott, could you raise your hand in the back there? I encourage everybody to say hello and have a conversation with Scott. He's got a lot of great ideas about what we're working on. So I want to talk a little bit briefly. So protect natural resources clearly is a shared value in this room. I recognize no matter what organization that you work for, that ultimately underlying all of our work is this idea that we have to protect natural resources. And that is an underlying value of the work that we do in each of our 40 communities where we do local organizing, because people are motivated to protect the incredible landscapes and rural communities that they live in the West. And frankly, those communities are under attack, and those natural resources are under attack by corporations who are interested in taking all the value and externalizing all of the costs. And so we organize folks who are dealing with the externalized costs of energy and agriculture. Everything from dealing with fracking to coal mining, uranium mining, and frankly, the transition of agriculture to what it is today, monoculture and genetically modified crops and pesticides and that sort of thing. But I only have a few minutes, so I actually want to tell you about a story about our relationship to the Farm Bill that addresses some of the challenges that we face and how we're moving toward a solution. And it's a story about collaboration, and I think it's really important in a room where we're trying to figure out how do we collaborate nationally, because frankly, it's urgent that we do and that we figure it out. So I'm really glad that we're here and starting this conversation. So some of you have heard this story before, so bear with me. In 2012, our director, Pat Sweeney, who many of you know and have worked with, he's an incredible leader for 40 years of doing this work. He got together with folks from the Midwest, including Mark Schultz from the Land Stewardship Project, who's here today, Rhonda Perry from the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, and Hugh Espy from the Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, and basically just looked at the Farm Bill and said, what the hell? What is happening here? And they realized that this Farm Bill, it doesn't reflect our values, and it certainly doesn't reflect the needs of rural communities and the folks that are in our membership, and that frankly we need to do something very different. So we're fighting for crumbs, and they're not even new crumbs. We're holding on to a few of the reforms that, especially in work, our relationship to the Farm Bill has been on livestock market reform, so country of origin labeling and GIPSA rules are our main thrust in work on the Farm Bill. And those are our members' biggest farm bill priorities, but of course we care about things like local food funding, organic research, those sort of things that are all important in the Farm Bill. And we realize that we have to do something bigger and better, and for each win that we win, so we get 1, the other side gets 9, and we're not even competing in those fights. So we realize we have to have a more holistic view, and we've got to get better at what we do. So this was a recognition that we have to confront corporate, political, and economic power, and that we need to, what we share in this collaborative is a theory of change. That change happens with organized people who are directly impacted and who are organizing to act locally in their communities around demands that they need in order to improve their lives. This is the kind of the thing that brings our collaboration together as grassroots organizing and shifting power. And so I like how Jahi put it, that it's we wanted to form our own tent in a village of tents. And the tent that we organized is a collaborative around 4 main areas. And so we recognize that we need to do expansive base building. We are already communicating with 60,000 households in rural communities, but we need to double, triple, quadruple that number. Another thing we need to do is raise significant resources for this base building, power shifting work. Another thing that is new, and something I'm going to talk a little bit more about, is that we have to shift the dominant narrative about agriculture. And I'm going to come back to what that means. And then finally, we need to wage a joint campaign with the 10 states that are in this collaborative, 3 in the Midwest and 7 that are in the West, in order to have a vehicle to be able to build power and to shift narrative. So we had to, we sort of recognize that there's economic and political power, but that one thing that maintains those is an underlying dominant narrative that maintains the status quo, and that sort of we recognize that we're losing the battle of ideas around agriculture. So the dominant narrative, that's sort of the idea that it's sort of what most people believe is true. It's some of our members have been referring to it as like the tape that plays in your mind. Some others call it ideology, but it's sort of like what most people believe to be true about agriculture. And some of those things are that the U.S., that we need to feed the world. Like, this is a story that we hear all the time. It's sort of underlying. So when you're working on local food, you're confronting the fact that folks think agriculture is about the fact that we need to feed the world, and that justifies, some of the worst policies that we end up seeing, the worst practices that we end up seeing, and that food should be cheap, that bigger and fewer farms are better because they're more efficient. I'm just going to list a couple of these. That science and technology will and do have the answers that we need, that our food system provides choice and abundance and cheap food, and that rural people aren't sophisticated and need knowledgeable people to guide them. These are some of the dominant narratives about agriculture. And frankly, that hunger, which many of you would recognize, is a result of not growing enough food. That's sort of what people believe. So if these are the things that people believe, we had to teach ourselves about it. So what we did in 2013 was we worked with the folks from the Grassroots Policy Project, and we organized in our 10 states 160 members to do sort of a train the trainers, so we could have this conversation be happening in our local communities, where we talked about what the heck is narrative? What is the current dominant narrative? And then how do we shift toward a narrative that promotes and supports and underlies the issues, the values that we deeply care about? And what was great about that process, we had folks get together, 160, they got together 2 times throughout last year, and what they were able to do was, this process was able to articulate a gut feeling that people had that weren't able to articulate, like, why are we're organizing and we're fighting and we're winning these battles, but why is it that we're coming up against so many challenges? And partly it's because there was this invisible power that we weren't confronting, which is the narrative. And that by shifting narrative, we open the door to more wins that we can have later. It's about sort of laying the groundwork for yourselves to be able to win more. I can talk more about that, but so we recognize that you can't just sort of shift the narrative. Your goal can't be, let's go shift the narrative, that we need a vehicle in order to be able to do that, and the vehicle is a joint campaign. And so what we're doing right now is launching into, we evaluated lots of campaigns that we could work on. If the Farm Bill were still happening, maybe that might have been one, but of course the Farm Bill just wrapped up. And so the vehicle that we have chosen is that we have to stop fast-track legislation to stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership and TAFTA. All right, there's some unity in this room, right? Because we recognize that everything that we're fighting for at the local level, that we're organizing around in communities, can be undermined by international trade agreements that can that elevate the right of foreign corporations to nations, that they can drag states, municipalities, counties to international courts, which undermine domestic policy. So if we make change, say, we're working on local food procurement policies. So in Montana, we fought and won for the right of colleges to be able to buy Montana beef, even if it costs more than other states or other countries. And that procurement policy can be undermined by, say, a multinational beef packer can challenge that in an international court and say that promotes Montana beef at the expense of others. So these are the kind of policies that we recognize. If we don't work to stop these trade agreements, then all the work that we're doing at the local level is going to be undermined. So look, we all want to protect natural resources. It's clearly one of the values that that drives what we do. It's very obvious when you live out west and you're surrounded by the most beautiful natural resources. There's certainly a feeling, a motivation to protect that area. But we know that we need better farm policy as part of that picture, and we recognize that the key here is not just that we don't have enough ideas or creativity, but that we need power in order to shift the priorities that are in DC and the priorities in our state, and that we're organizing in a better and more sophisticated way in order to be able to do that.
The reason we took that position was that we wanted the investigation to look at to what degree was Walmart driving consolidation down up the supply chain. And because that has not been looked at. And if you go back to 1987, Walmart wasn't even selling groceries, and today they're approaching 25% of the U.S. grocery market. They're above 50% in probably about 30 or so regional markets. So that was a big concern of ours, because if you got a fair price for farmers between ranchers and the packers, for example, and the farmers actually got good antitrust enforcement that delivered them a fair share of the retail value, if Tyson is still getting squeezed by Walmart, then Tyson's going to turn to us at the negotiating table and say that it's got to come out of the workers' pockets to pay for the farmers. So I think that goes to the theme of this conference of, it's a good example of why we need to bridge those gaps and come up with a unified position on that. And I think we did finally get the FTC at the last hearing. And unfortunately, what the FTC commissioner or bureaucrat said was that Walmart's firepower is a good thing, and that's what our antitrust policy, because the only thing our antitrust policy looks at is whether or not it provides a lower price for consumers. And part of that goes back, well, all of that really goes back to a 1978 book by Robert Bork called The Antitrust Paradox that ended up getting cited after 30 years. Basically, he argued that that same argument, that was the only intent of Congress for antitrust laws was to provide lower prices to consumers. He argued that for a decade or so and then wrote this book. And when the Reagan administration came in, the court started citing that book and upholding that interpretation of antitrust law in the United States. And eventually the Supreme Court, adopted that, and that's where we're at. That the Supreme Court has now ruled that is the only purpose of antitrust laws, is to provide lower prices to consumers. So that is a huge problem, and that I think is a big part of why that whole antitrust initiative collapsed, is that all the agencies throw up their hands, and even private litigators throw up their hands because you can't win at the Supreme Court. And the only thing I would say that goes back to the earlier point, the final point would be, is if you look at, in 2008, the UK Competition Commission actually did an investigation into supermarket buyer power, and unlike the Obama administration, they did not punt. They actually came up with a grocery supply code of practice that basically bans certain practices in the supply chain by large supermarkets. And I think it goes back to Scott's point that maybe this is a new place to start looking as far as regulating supply chains. It was sort of a supplier's bill of rights, and maybe that's one area that we need to start looking at.
Thanks, Dennis. Scott, did you want to react?
One of my heroes, to stay at sort of 50,000 feet, one of my heroes is Bill Heffernan from Missouri. A lot of people in the room know Bill, and he's done extraordinary work. And one of the quotes of his that I draw on a lot is, one of the things that he said was, the hallmark of early capitalism is competition. The hallmark of late capitalism is concentration. And too often, what we claim is the former when what we have is the latter. And we see that frequently in terms of people claiming democracy and capitalism in ways that are true to neither. And so part of this, and I really appreciated what you were saying about retaking the dominant message, the dominant narrative. But part of this is that these issues cut to the core of both democracy and capitalism in ways that, if we can speak to them truthfully, go our way. And we just don't talk about them that way. I think, we can talk commodity policy for a long time, but that was just sort of what came to mind for me.
I'm curious, Liz, you talked about power building, and many of us were involved in those 2010 antitrust hearings put on by USDA and Department of Justice. And they were great for power building. Huge grassroots crowds packed those hearing rooms across the country. And yet, Department of Justice walked away or walked back from that work. And one of the things that hasn't become clear to me is how to harness the power that was in those rooms and where to take the antitrust work next, because it was palpable if you were in any of those hearing rooms. Liz, do you have any comments on that from your work or from Western Organization Resource Council's perspective?
Sure, yeah. Unfortunately, it really was. It was a great moment. It was a power building moment. Lots of groups were there. Lots of our members, got on a bus and went to Fort Collins from all over the West. It was a pretty powerful experience. And unfortunately, what ended up happening in DC was sort of soul crushing. And it has been a challenge. In fact, many of our livestock producer members, who are among our strongest leaders in our organizations at the local chapter level and statewide, it's been very tough for us to recover from what happened with the DOJ hearings and what happened afterward when nothing happened. I saw Kathy has a copy of The Meat Racket, Chris Leonard's new book, which one of those chapters really does discuss exactly what happened in DC, how GIPSA, basically collapsed and didn't come through, that the meat industry, they sort of pulled all the food industry together to be able to shut down any advances that were made and any of the changes that we called for. If I had to, we don't have the silver bullet. We don't have in fact, we're trying right now to sort of figure it out, but what we do know is that we have to organize, and that was the most visible power that the food industry, not just the meat industry, meat packers, but the food industry came together. When one of them was questioned, when one of them was sort of put under assault, they all came together. And so it's clear what we are up against, and it's even more important that we're here today because we have to confront that and we have to figure out how to do something different, because we can't count on the federal government, we can't count on DOJ to do what they need to do to bust the trusts.
Thanks, Liz. That might be an interesting conversation around the edges today, where the antitrust work goes next. I see hands from Kathy and from Mark, and then from Steve. Kathy? Stand up, maybe someone can get you a mic.
Hi there, I'm Kathy Ozer with the National Family Farm Coalition. Really appreciate this discussion, and I was actually going to make a comment a little bit about the DOJ and USDA workshops, but actually thinking that many of the issues we were fighting in this last Farm Bill was to try and hold on to what had been some small but significant wins in the last Farm Bill, and just how important that implementation process was, that building and keeping pressure on. And I think in a lot of ways, while the DOJ and USDA workshops did not do anywhere near what we were hoping would have come out of this administration, it did, as you're saying, very clearly show where the opposition is. And in the last days of this Farm Bill, when we were fighting to keep the total dismantling of GIPSA and the dismantling of country of origin labeling, the fact that the commodity groups and a lot of the industry sent a letter to the Hill basically saying they would consider opposing this entire Farm Bill because they didn't dismantle COOL and GIPSA, helps to really expose sort of who's on what side and how these issues are playing out. The one other thing I would say is that, and Dennis mentioned this about the role of the Federal Trade Commission, is that actually early this year, Food and Water Watch sent an amazing letter to the administration urging them to intervene in the proposed merger of Cisco and US Foods. And so when we talk about what's going on now, where pricing and how do we hold on to the ability of people who are raising food and working in the food system to hold on to some fairness in that system, those kind of mergers happening and us just sitting by in a previous situation, at least there's some hope to sort of intervene and ask some important questions. So I think that we're the first to say we didn't get what we all wanted out of the DOJ-USDA process, but it did wake up a lot of people in the process, and one of the outcomes was a reporter like Chris Leonard, who was covering those issues. And 4 years ago, we all met in Ankeny, Iowa, writing this book, which really comes from a business reporter's perspective. And similar to Fred's comment about when the business folks are talking in a way, it's to a different audience, it's in a little different style, and them joining with us and telling the story is incredibly powerful, and we're doing what we can to take advantage of that right now. Thank you.
That was Kathy Ozer, National Family Farm Coalition.
I said who it was.
Did you? Ah, I missed it. Mark.
Thanks. Mark Schultz with Land Stewardship Project. Hey, I welcome everybody to our Minnesota spring. It's really quite nice. You know, what I have to say, and then I want to ask this of Scott and Liz, whose presentations I thought were great. But you know, we could unite the power of all the organizations in this room with the power of all the organizations and people who wanted to be here, and I suspect all the power of everyone who was invited. And it wouldn't be enough for what we need to do, because corporate power has gone that far. So I want to challenge people, and we each have different sources of power, but people, money, ideas into action. I want to challenge us all to say we all have to greatly expand our power. We could put this all together here and we'd have a more efficient little gizmo spinning around if we united what we have now. And that'll actually be able to move something more maybe than we've been able to move. But it wouldn't be enough. We need a bigger engine, or a bigger, you know, we need more. And so when Liz was talking about the collaborative project that she mentioned about the 10 states, that's a step towards greatly expanding our power. And I want to leave it with one other thing and then put it back to Liz and Scott. I also believe one way to think about it is that you need to have the power in your state or your community to move a corporate target, or to move a member of Congress, or to move your governor. I mean, we have this, you know, it's not just numbers. It's like, can you actually move and win and make that deal stick? Okay? So, what do you two think about that?
It's brilliant.
Would you like to elaborate, Scott?
No, I'm just kidding. One of the issues that we're working on right now is we've got a collaborative called Come to the Table, which deals with food issues. And what it came out of was a conversation a few years ago, actually 6 or 8 years ago, where there was a realization that the people the food access community, activists in the food access community, and folks in the sustainable ag community were working in diametrically opposite ways. I mean, almost on the opposite sides of individual bills and individual policies. And it was largely around the issue of price, because what was good for you was bad for me. You know, if you don't want prices, if your concept of food security was just about price, then you don't want anybody to get a higher price for anything. And if your concept of you know, farm sustainability was around price, then you want to get the prices as high as you can. And what this project has been convening the faith community to bring the two sides together to get beyond that conversation of price, to get beyond it, to say, you know, there is much more to talk about here than just what's good for you is bad for me. And that's been a fascinating conversation, both in the need to meet people where they are and at the level of analysis that they are at. For a lot of folks, their level of entry was a community garden or something like that, which is not exactly a bastion. I mean, it's not exactly like, you know, deep analysis of federal commodity and food policy, but it is the need to meet people exactly where they are and where they resonate, and then offer the opportunities to deepen that conversation. And what we've seen, and it's taken a long time, but what happened was this move that was started at very direct issues of, you know, just community gardens, which moved to, well, wait, where are we sourcing our food for church issues, for church events? Well, wait a minute, where are we sourcing food for the soup? And moved through until in our last meetings, there were deep conversations about SNAP and EBT at farmers market and SNAP benefits and the need and all those other stuff. So it's a natural evolution, but the challenge here is, the challenge, especially for people like me who love to talk about federal commodity policy, is to be able to connect with people where they are. Now, I believe that the biggest entry point that we have, that is when a person goes to a farmer's market, buys something direct from a farmer that they feel good about, has the fullness of that experience, takes it home and cooks it and feeds it to their kids. That, to me, that is such a huge gateway point for people's awareness and understanding of food issues, that we have to protect that ground as deeply as we can. And you know, the thing that keeps coming up from one of the things that I had written down here that I didn't go over was the whole issue of choice, of people having choice in terms of where they shop, and farmers having choice in terms of how they produce. Because one of the things that is true, one of the major impacts of a poultry contract is that a farmer has zero choice. You have no choice, you have no innovation. It completely, the production contracts completely eliminate farmer innovation. And so to me, our ability to broaden that base, which I think is, Mark, you're absolutely right, and if I knew all the secrets to it, I would know a lot more than I do. But our ability to meet people exactly where they are and help open up to see across non-obvious partnerships, but also to be able to hear, for us to meet where we are and be able to walk through this learning together, both on what they're dealing with and what we're dealing with. Anyway.
Liz, if Western Organization or Resource Council knows anything, they know power building.
Oh, yeah.
What are your comments or reactions to Mark's comments that we need to dramatically increase our power base to move targets and how to go about it?
Sure. Yeah, we know that's what we need to do, and we're working with Mark and LSP and in this 10-state collaborative, which is just growing what we have been doing for 40 years, which is really exciting, because we have to be able to win at the local level, because that is how we build power. But what I think is really important is what Scott's talking about, is this question of like, what's happening right now, what's really exciting is that people are thinking about food, and they're thinking about local food. And so we have to meet them where they're at, even if that is a community garden, and we have to get to where they have, sort of experienced the transformative process, or that transformation where they understand, and like our members do, like many of our leaders, where they will, when asked about what's one of the biggest problems in agricultural policy, and they say, Citizens United. Mm-hmm. And so that is an analysis that's broader than just, say, commodities or that sort of problem. So what we're ultimately, when we're talking about organizing, it's about the transformation of the individual from where they're at to where they have this broader analysis, and then they're willing to work for it and to work for that sort of change that they need at the local level.
And there's one thing I want to throw out, and this is, I believe this very, very deeply, and it's something that Kwame brought up and alluded to briefly, but I think it is impossible to have conversations and address issues of agriculture without addressing issues of race. I deeply believe it can't be done. And it makes it more complicated. It brings in a whole nother set of challenges and questions and issues. But I as deeply as I believe anything in my life, I believe you cannot speak to agriculture and agricultural issues without addressing issues of race, because you are addressing issues of race, you just may not be putting it on the table. And it becomes all kinds of signals and all kinds of other things. And so I recognize that it adds a level of challenge and a whole different, but it is a whole different set of players and a whole different set of issues. But I just don't think it can be done.
We have time for one or two more questions.
I was in line.
Steve was in line, but he is correct.
Yeah. I'm Steve Supan. I work with Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And a good part of my work over the last 5 years has been working on financial and commodity market reform issues. concerning Dodd-Frank. And so, for me to hear that the Gibson hearings went nowhere, knowing that the Justice Department could bring itself to prosecute HSBC for 10 years of laundering money for drug cartels, and has similarly it refused to prosecute J.P. Morgan for criminal violations and fixing the prices of electricity, and that despite adverse opinions from the DOJ Inspector General. My desire to work with DOJ is pretty minimal. However, under the theme of non-traditional alliances, I do think it is eminently worth reaching out to insurance companies and to community banks, because essentially the desperate move to trying to ensure revenue for farmers and abandoning government price intervention policies is basically a sign of a lack of ideas to deal with, among other things, climate change. Because climate change is going to make agriculture uninsurable no matter how much big data is applied to try to make insurance policies essentially kind of casino. If you live here, you shouldn't be planting this, right? That's the whole theory behind big data. So I think one thing to do is to reach out to insurance companies now and to say that, okay, taxpayers are subsidizing 62% of crop insurance, but this isn't sustainable because the planting zone is going to change so much, drought is going to decimate, and most importantly, positive feedback loops are going to make it impossible for you to calculate premiums. At the same time, you've got community bankers and municipalities that have been getting screwed by Wall Street in trying to salvage themselves through a quasi-insurance mechanism in the derivatives market. That's not working either, and of course it's not coincidental that Spencer Bacchus is the chair of the Finance Committee. His county experienced the largest municipal bankruptcy before Detroit. Okay, so we do have some potential allies. The last one to mention is that the whole philosophy of law and economics that basically subordinates criminal justice to whether or not it has bad economic effects for our largest actors. Somebody like the University of Chicago's Richard Posner, who invented law and economics, is now distraught about what his philosophy has wrought. So there are some potential unconventional alliances, and we need to build them, and really fast.
Thanks, Steve. We'll go to closing comments from our panelists. If you have any reaction quickly to Steve, you can share that in your closing comments, but also think about what you see as some of the key opportunities for forward progress in this area going forward. Scott?
I wanted to respond first to your comment, which is I think that our work, our analysis is that crop insurance and access to credit are deeply intertwined and form what is in essence a glass ceiling for the expansion and the growth of sustainably produced food. And in essence, what we've created is a situation where we have an economic feedback loop that rewards the worst players. Because quite simply, if I do a bunch of stuff to address risk within my production practices and Fred doesn't, and at the end of the year, crop insurance makes us even, I lost, right? That's it. And so what we're talking about is the deep analysis of our programs, which make, right now, the fact that a person is a good steward of their land and animals and community is a major economic disadvantage, which a series of companies are highly able to exploit. Poultry growers basically keep going only to hold on to, they don't make money, they just hold on to farms. I mean, it is, people work off farm in order for the opportunity to stay farming, and companies are very strong at exploiting them. So we have over time, a lot of our work on conservation as a community has been around a conservation ethic and in essence an aesthetic. we should conserve things because, as we said, all you have to do is drive through the West and you want to conserve it. It's an aesthetic. It's we should conserve because we should. What we have the opportunity to do now and the responsibility to do now is to speak to issues of conservation and decentralization and localization, not as an aesthetic, but as a core survival mechanism with huge financial rewards and huge financial implications. And we're at this point working with actuaries to do the actuarial analysis of conservation programs for inclusion in both credit and insurance decision making. And so we're, as a movement, we're at the edge of a third wave. The first wave was we were out in the wilderness yelling and screaming and nobody really cared. We were all yelling about, it was all a bunch of hippies doing organic and that kind of stuff, and it was fun and nobody really listened anyway. The second wave, which was, I would say it was about the mid-90s to now, was sustainability as intellectual property. Suddenly you have intellectual property and value around understanding of sustainability. And you have major corporations talking about their sustainability and this as a value proposition. But where we are now is the entrance of big data into these issues. And if you aren't paying attention to Monsanto's purchase of Climate Corporation, their purchase of Climate Corporation, and then their addition of real-time GPS-based, cloud-based monitoring of yield and soil data, so that they will have real-time yield data integrated with weather and soil data. Okay, real-time yield data from across the Midwest. Stop and think about that for a second, what that means. We are at a point where our core concepts of sustainability and its value are about to be strongly tested by big data. Look at the OIG report on organic crop insurance last year and how that came down, and how both the analysis that was done and the way that it was communicated by USDA. That OIG report was very significant. So we are entering into a new opportunity to both find out there's a critical mass of data. We're going to have the opportunity and the responsibility to test our own assumptions. How do we know what we know? How do we know that what we do does things? And we have that responsibility, but being able to advocate from, well, I've been to Fred's farm and it really works, so that's what it all should look like. We're past that point. If we are dealing with anecdotal stuff, we're bringing a butter knife to a gunfight. And that's what the next to me, that's what both the opportunity, the huge opportunity, and the challenges of the next phase of the movement.
Thanks, Scott. Liz?
Right, so key opportunity for us moving forward for our work states and for the collaboration that we're in clearly this year is mobilizing around fast track, stopping fast track at the local level. And the fight where that's going to come down is lame duck this fall. If you're sort of interested in being part of that conversation, I'd love to talk more about what we need to do together. So that's one. Another is just the recognition that there are great networks, like that people are having this conversation all over. So for instance, last week there was a conversation in San Francisco where groups just like this around who are concerned about animal agriculture, it was the Animal Agriculture Reform Collaboration came together last week, having this same kind of conversation. And so of course, and we have NSAC and NFFC, there are these established networks already. And there are more that I can't name, and the opportunity is that we have is to create that village, the tent of tents, because we have to, because we're sort of at a moment where we need to. It's sort of that, or we continue to just be, lose the 9 fights and win 1 but lose 9. But that the challenge is that needs to be grounded in state-based groups who are doing local organizing, because we know that is how we can shift and move targets at the local level. And that we're never going to be able to match their money. And so the best that we can do is to organize people that can move targets. So when we're talking about this and how to move forward, we have to be cognizant and looking around and saying, where are the state-based groups that can do this work at the local level that can expand our base of people who are engaged and organized? And then finally, just overall, I think it's become clear, part of this conversation, like really there is this sort of third wave movement. There's a moment people are really concerned about their food, they're questioning food safety. These are moments that we can capitalize on where people are starting to think differently about their food, and that our challenge is to sort of, I hate to use this word, but we've got to politicize that. We've got to figure out how people get from recognizing that a community garden is valuable to understanding a political system that limits their choices at the market, or for that matter, has consolidated retail industry so that there's so few even grocery store choices. So those are the opportunities that we see.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, Scott. Thank you all for your participation in the conversation.